Hello and welcome to our video on our new MTFP model, updated version 5.12. We've updated it for a number of things that have happened since the final settlement. To start off with, CTR1 for 24-25 has come out with the actual Band D and tax bases for 2024-25, so they've been put through the model. We've also added in a new element to the model where you can estimate what you think you might get from the second home council tax premium. This comes in 2025-26, a new power for authorities to do that, but to do so you must have made a decision on that premium at least 12 months in advance of the financial year. So if you haven't made that decision yet, you won't get the premium. If you have, then you will. Our estimates are based on the second home data that's in the CTB1 for October 2023, so it's a little bit out of date, but we'll just take you through how we've done that calculation. We put through an additional year for new homes bonus in 2025-26. Now this is something that we've done for a number of years now. It's the sixth one-off payment if it were to be continued into 2025-26. Our conclusions, based on a lot of conversations we've had over the last few months, have been that an additional year for NHB is probably the most likely thing. A new government coming in, say in November or December, with very little time to think about what the settlement looks like, is likely to continue with the same structure of the settlement. That's the overwhelmingly the most likely scenario, but it's not definite. So we're giving you the option of selecting that or not. The estimates are currently based on CTB1 for October 2023. We've updated the Band D within the calculation, and also made no change to the threshold of 0.4%. So you may want to update those numbers. You may want to change the estimates within there based on what your more up-to-date local information is. Then, for the first time, we've got the four fire grants that authorities receive, either combined fire authorities, metropolitan fire authorities, or authorities with fire function. These are now added in with forecasts for future years, and we'll go through what those grants are, where they are in the model, and our forecasts for future years. We made a small change to the way that the systems assumptions tab works, just to give you more flexibility about how you forecast for each year from 2025-26 to 2030-31, just feeling that this is now going to be the key thing that we think about over the medium term. So a bit more flexibility about how we do those forecasts probably would help. We've removed the 2023 revaluation calculations. Data now is just from the final settlement adjustments that were applied to the top-ups and tariffs in this year's final settlement. The actual calculations are probably a bit redundant now because we know the actual numbers, but I'm sure they'll be coming back for the 2026 revaluation. Then the minimum funding guarantee, we've updated the tax base assumptions in there. Now we've got the CTR1, we can do that. They're based on the 4-year average change in tax base. No change to our assumptions for the threshold itself. We've still got 0% in 2025-26 compared to 4% in the current year, 2024-25. And then we made a couple of amendments to help you manage or mitigate or just update the potential impact of the funding reforms on local government. We're still assuming that, or we're still working on the basis that they may happen in 2026-27. But the two changes we've brought in are, first of all, reintroducing the damping methodology that allows you to spread losses over 4 or 5 years, rather than simply having a funding floor set to, say, 5% of total resources. And we'll show you the impact of that. And also an option to scale back the gains from the business rate baseline reset. Now, these numbers, as you know, in our model have grown quite large now because business rate retention in the model is so significant, and I know a lot of you have been concerned about the scale of those gains, so there's now an option there that allows you to scale those back. So let's start off by looking at the second home premium. This is something new we've added in to the model in version 5.12, and you can see here in the C-Tax tab, we've used Cornwall as an example because I think they're the authority that's possibly going to get the highest or the largest income stream from second home premium. You'll see here a drop down menu that allows you to turn this function on or off. also a drop-down list allowing you to select a proportion of Band D that can be applied as a premium. I'm assuming most authorities will have 100% premium if that's what you've decided to do, but this gives you the option of looking at different premiums and the impact on your future income stream. Now, the data we've got at the moment is from the CTB1 in October 2023. This is the latest data that's available, but it's likely to be a little bit out of date and will, I'm sure, change by the time you actually come around to set the council tax next year. Clearly, this has not been kept up to date because you haven't needed to, because you haven't had a second home discount in a number of years. People living in homes and second homes and primary residences will have changed designation over that time and not necessarily informed the billing authority. And also, as you start to apply this premium for 25-26, some people will decide that one home is a primary home rather than a second home, and things will change. So we've got a drop down here that allows you to either use the latest CTB1 numbers or to apply your own local estimates to have a different number in there for what you think's a more likely outcome. And then that figure will flow through into the council tax element of the MTFP tab. Then if you have a look at the NHB changes, as you mentioned, we've got this additional further payment in 2025-26. You can simply select that, turn it on or off. We've updated the Band D element within that calculation to the latest 2024 average Band D equivalent council tax, and we've kept the national baseline the same at 0.4%. That then flows through into the NHB tab, and you can see there just how we've had these extra one-off payments over, well, this would be the 6th year we've had it in 2025-26, if that's indeed what happens. For some authorities, particularly districts, but also for unitaries and other types of authority, this can be a really important element in your income stream. Then let's look at the fire grants. This is another new element within the model. We've not previously had fire grants within the MTFP model, but I think they're becoming more integrated into the overall funding system. Clearly, the pensions grant was rolled into RSG in 24-25, and possibly that's something that will happen to other fire grants in the future as well. It's difficult to get hold of the data on fire grants, so I really appreciate those fire authorities who sent me data on the fire grants from 22-23, 23-24, and for the current financial year as well. And they're shown here in this tab within the model. We've also got forecasts going forward into 25-26 and later years as well. You'll notice here too, we've got the new fire grant that was introduced in 24-25. We've currently got it as a one-off grant rather than an ongoing grant. That was kind of indicated in the letter to fire authorities, but that's something we can look at in terms of what our forecasts are. If we look next at the systems assumptions tab, you can see here that I've set out the assumptions in a slightly different way. So it's, I think, easier to see all in one place what the changes are in SFA and the other sort of core grants over the medium term from 25-26 going forwards as well. So you'll see here that we've still got a 0% cash flat assumption as our default assumption for SFA, but you can change that year by year over this period. I think this is probably a little bit more sensitive to what might happen over this period. Clearly, we've got a government that will be coming in fairly shortly before a provisional settlement, we're assuming in the autumn, and the assumption that they may make in terms of growth in SFA in 25-26 might be different from what happens in 26-27, at which point we would have had a spending review. And also towards the end of this period as well, potentially, if the public finances have got a bit better, we may expect to see some growth towards the end. So that gives you more flexibility to come up with scenarios for what might happen over that whole period. For public health grant, we've got a few different options in this drop down. A 2% uplift, CPI, or cash flat. You can choose. You can see there in previous years it's bounced around between about 1.3%, 2.8%, and a promise that it would be maintained in real terms, which would be about 2%. So different things you can think of there about for your forecasting. RSG, although it has gone up, sorry, RSDG, although it has gone up quite substantially in recent years, we've got a cash flat forecast for the medium term. For the minimum funding guarantee, you'll see here that 23-24 was 3%, 24-25%, 24-25 went up to 4%. In 25-26, I think it'll go down to something quite a lot lower. I think 0% is probably the most likely figure if we assume that overall core spending power without Band D will have gone down quite a lot. In the current year, it was about 4.5%. I think that could be more like 1.1% or 1.5%. So I think a good deal lower for that threshold in 25-26. Then for social care grants, we're assuming that anything that's in your baseline in 24-25 will stay there. So no cuts in the existing funding for social care. That's our very strong assumption there. But for the future, again, I think it's really unlikely that there won't be further increases in social care funding for authorities. So we've got a range of different options from this drop-down list. Our default assumption is £500 million per year, but clearly you can change that to based on what you think's whether you want to show a more optimistic or more pessimistic outcome. We've also got assumptions here for fire grants for each of the ones that are currently in place. Protection grant, New Dimension grant, FireLink grant. Again, we're assuming cash flat over that entire period. And for the new pensions grant that was introduced in 24-25, we've assumed that is one-off and that will disappear in 25-26, but clearly you can change that if you wish. You'll see as well that we've removed the 2023 revaluation tabs from the model here. Certainly the big calculation tab is now gone, but you'll be able to find all the RV data that was published by DLUC as part of the settlement in this tab. It's basically standing data rather than any calculation. So anything that is used within the model, the adjustments to top-ups and to tariffs and the one-off adjustments as well, they're all here based on actual numbers from the settlement, and they all flow through the model in exactly the same way as they did previously. I'm assuming that in 2026 revaluation that the same methodology would be used, and we'll bring back the same kind of calculation. I would assume that DLUC will make some small changes to the calculations, but broadly the same methodology would be in place. I think for now, for authorities, the best thing to assume is that any future effect of revaluation is neutral on your bottom line finances. Then let's have a quick look at the minimum funding guarantee calculations. You find these in the LA aggregates tab. Most of the elements of it are fairly straightforward. It's a change in BFL, RSG, or other grants. The thing that was trickier this time round was looking at what the changes in tax base, because obviously the minimum funding guarantee applies to changes in grants and then changes in council tax excluding Band D. So the assumptions for the change in tax base are really quite important. We've updated those for the change in the tax base from the CTR1, and we've got calculations for what the tax base change is based on the movement in tax base. I think it's the 5-year moving average. So you see here as well that it'll calculate for you what we think that minimum funding guarantee is, but crucially, we're looking at a threshold that's reduced from 4% to 0%. We've mentioned already you can change that in the system's assumptions tab if you wish, but our default assumption here is that it's 0%. And finally, we've made a couple of new amendments to the systems assumptions tab, which allow you to change the impact of what might happen in future funding reforms. We're still assuming that they would take place in 2026-27, but clearly, as we know now, that that they're really difficult changes to make. They could easily be delayed. They could easily be changed quite substantially by a new government. So we haven't changed the substance of what we think might happen in a set of funding reforms or when we think they might happen, but there are just two new changes we've introduced here that you can amend to change the impact on your finances. So as you're probably aware that we've had a damping system in place within the model, which essentially assumes that no authority can lose more than, say, 5% of its total resources in any one year. And for some authorities, that would allow them to lose really quite significant sums of money in any one year. So if we look at Surrey, for example, you can see this is an authority where we think they might lose quite substantially from a fair funding review because of council tax equalisation. You can see the extent of the reduction in total resources in 26-27, but that's not enough to trigger that 5% threshold for damping in our modelling. So they would not receive any damping in this scenario, and indeed will be paying over, but through scaling back to fund damping for other authorities. So what we've introduced here is the ability to spread the damping over 4 or 5 years. So to work out essentially what are the losses from damping, not to take house tax into account, but basically to say how long, what sort of funding would that authority get if the losses were damped over 5 years. And you can see here that makes quite a big difference for someone like Surrey. So in essence, it damps everything over a long period of time, and will give them quite substantial amounts of damping in each of those years. 101 million in year 1, 81 million, 60, etc. So quite significant sums. Now, in terms of whether one form of damping is more or less likely, it's difficult to know. Personally, I think this form of damping, where we're spreading it over 5 years, is possibly a little bit too generous. Those authorities who are gaining will want to see those gains come through much more quickly. But I think it's worth authorities having that as an option to be able to forecast and see what the assumptions might be. You can try different assumptions with those losses coming through sooner rather than later. But our core assumption is still that you would set that figure to 0, and that allows the 5% funding floor to be used, and that makes a big difference, I think, to people's funding. Look at the different scenarios and think about what you think is the most likely, or how you would respond to different damping scenarios in the future. The other change we've made is to allow you to scale back the gains from the business rate baseline reset. You can use this drop down list here to scale it back by or to show 100% of the gains coming through, or to scale it back to 75%, 50%, or 25%. And again, just looking at Surrey as an example, you can see here we're assuming some really quite significant amounts of funding that would come back to an authority. The significant sums for every authority, but these are based on our assessment that the overall baseline reset would free up about £1.5 billion worth of retained business rates. We're redistributing that based on needs, based on a share of baseline funding level. So for someone like Surrey, that's as much as 14 million, quite a significant sum. And as we've been flagging for quite a long time, they are quite high risk assumptions. That's quite a lot of money to be building into your future forecasts. So we recognise that uncertainty, and we're giving you the option to scale those gains back by using that drop down list there. So you can see we're changing those quite significantly and reducing them quite significantly if that's what you wish to do. It doesn't quite work on a system level, because if the government has promised that all those gains, the £1.5 billion of gains, or we've also got quite significant sums coming back from return cap compensation funding as well, we would assume that all those resources would stay within the sector. So if they're not going through this return system, then they would need to be redistributed in some other way, maybe through social care grant, maybe through damping support, or some other format. So just to be aware, I think those sums of money would stay within the system, but I think if you're changing these shares here, then what you're saying is that you as an authority would get a smaller share of those gains than we're assuming in our default assumption. Okay, well, thanks for listening. I hope that's been useful. Please feel free to come back to me and ask any further questions about how the model works, and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.